There are no Martian architects, there are no Martian buildings, and yet Mars is waiting to be built.
The Interplanetary podcast. The exploration of space for the benefit of all humankind. Your hosts in England, Rob Annable and Matt Russell.
Yeah, baby. Oh, yeah. Louis Kahn. Louis Kahn. Tell us a bit about Louis Kahn.
Louis Kahn, an architect with a deft turn of phrase, had a lot to say about bricks.
He did have a lot to say about bricks, and I particularly, we were tossing a coin about whether it was going to be this one or the sun didn't know how great it was until it first hit a wall or reflected off a wall, or variations on that. But of course, shall we let people into a little secret there, Rob?
I should let the cat out of the bag, I suppose. Yeah.
What is the cat in the bag?
Well,
is it a Schrodinger's cat?
That was a collaboration between Louis Kahn and the GPT-3 AI when we punched in a request asking it to give us a quote.
Yeah, we couldn't.
Based on Louis Kahn.
Couldn't come up with a quote, so I said, "Give me an inspiring quote about architecture on Mars by Louis Kahn," and that's what it spat out. It's not. I didn't think it was too bad.
No, amazing.
Almost like it's sentient.
So we've been talking a lot about AIs when we've been chatting, because of course we've been getting stuck in on the Discord with our new space art channel. So worth just having a quick chat about that. It's been great fun with the other patrons.
I tell you what's been great fun about it. I really am trying to get it to generate the next podcast logo. As you know, I like to change it up every couple of years or so. Been trying to do one where it's me and Linn. So it's like a sort of female character and a male character in space type thing. Trying to maybe keep the Lego theme. So it's been chucking out some interesting. It's been chucking out some interesting little pictures. I haven't quite got it yet, but it's kind of really interesting. But I thought one of the really interesting things is how it sort of plays in with, space imagery that's really, really popular, or, like designs of Mars habitats. And obviously this is what this episode's about, is Mars habitats on the whole. And it's like how it generates something like that, and just how inspiring it is almost. Like you can put in a Mars habitat and it'll spit out something pretty cool. And then my question to you, Rob, is how different is that to a sketch that an artist or an architect or a engineer or scientist might be putting together for an actual Mars habitat they're thinking of?
Yeah. So as you can imagine, there's been a lot of debates in the art and illustrating world, and in my sector a little bit as well, about the power and potential of these tools, and also some grave concern about what they might do to employment for artists and illustrators. But they definitely have to be engaged with and grappled with, I think, if you work in that sector and field, to understand what's possible. And I think there's some people who are doing some really interesting work using them as tools for inspiration, in much the same way that you would do by compiling precedents, looking at other studies and examples of artwork, drawings, visual information, and then undertaking your own process of making to combine and create new inspirational images. But of course, the speed and rapidity of the process is mind-blowing, that you can turn out so many variations so quickly. Yeah,
and cheap and pretty cheaply, really. You can. I've been doing variation upon variation, and for a £10 subscription to Midjourney a month, it's just like wow. It's just particularly bonkers. It's funny you say that you're having a sort of debate in the architectural world. It's like a debate that no one wants to have in the music world, in the music industry. But do you think that there are? I mean, that technology surely applies just to virtually any place where you've got some form of creative design, or you need some inspiration or some, kicking starting point. Just seems to be unbelievable.
Absolutely. I mean, as a process, looking out into the world, soaking up references and other people's work, and it folding into your own practices is a natural part of how we all build on the shoulders of giants and go forward. The debate, of course, is around a lack of clarity about the sources and training data.
Mm-hmm.
And it does get pretty unnerving when an image comes back at you that seems to have somebody's signature in the bottom right-hand corner.
Yeah.
That raises eyebrows. Yeah, it's clearly pulling in visual images and then regurgitating those actual moments. But what's complicated, of course, is that you can't unpick it. You can't unravel it to work out where the parts were and point to references or citations.
Well, that for me is back to that conundrum. I'm sure Philip K. Dick and a few others sort of pointed out that your brain contains the copyright information anyway. That's what your brain is doing. You've got this big library of copyrighted information that you're smashing together to make new things. That's just the nature of the beast, isn't it? It's complicated. But let's not get too bogged down in AI. Other than to say, I do think it. In terms of things like sci-fi, fantasy, and scientific, even sort of imagery of nebulas and things like that. It's just so interesting with things like, particularly with the James Webb Telescope images coming back, and of course they're not real. That's not how they look, or is it? And does the brain do things like that? And it's like it does put into question what's real and what's not real. What's wrong with, say, the AI putting together a picture of what an exoplanet looks like with sufficient data? It's probably just as good a stab as the artist impressions have been anyway. Yeah.
I mean, it's a really interesting debate around sort of science communication as well and visual images. One of the things I've really enjoyed using the tool for and sharing on the Discord has been explicitly thinking about particular sort of seminal science or space images and asking Midjourney, in the case that we've been using, to redraw or reimagine those visuals in the style of a particular artist. And for me, that's quite interesting because it covers two bases. One, to begin with, because of the murky ethics, it felt to me like explicitly citing an artist, particularly one who is long since dead and beyond copyright questions. It's part of the way to maybe navigate through those ethics, but also to be able to rethink key moments in science communication using painting. So, for example, one of the ones I tried early on was I asked it to do a painting of the black hole, the M87 black hole, in the style of Caravaggio, for example. And it did an incredible job of repainting that image using those same sort of qualities of brushstrokes. And I think there's opportunity for it to be used as a different type of science communication to talk about the accretion disk. Or gravity lensing.
I wonder,
in a different way because it's been painted instead of.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could even write in a version because there's lots of different versions of this software, isn't there? Like Midjourney, Imagine, and DALL-E 2, and all these. So it would be easy to imagine a version of it that uses more scientific data, so that it is a tool for science communication. Like you said, makes the picture of the black hole, which for me, as a science communicator, it's a little bit awkward because it's not great. It's a blurry donut, really.
Yeah,
and therefore it relies totally on you to come up with the story about why that picture is so amazing. Yeah. But really, you want to grab people's attention with the picture in the first place, or else, what's the point of the picture? You're better off showing it at the end rather than at the beginning. But it is really interesting. Now, you did one that I just thought was absolutely genius, which is obviously we've got SLS coming up, and we should mention SLS because let's face it, it's the rocket launch of the year, other than Vega C, because that was awesome because it had an amazing commentator on the English channel, I've heard. But I
heard it was quite good.
But the SLS is coming up, and I've got an interview with a guy in a minute with who is at the opposite end of the spectrum, trying to launch a tiny rocket rather than a massive rocket. But it'll be the biggest rocket ever coming up. But it has the Orion capsule that it's sending round the moon, and you put in a certain artist that you turned me on to, the reimagining of what the Orion capsule should look like inside. And I just thought it was amazing, that it had heard of that artist and was able to do such a good job.
Yeah. It produced quite a startling image, and we definitely need to share it on the website afterwards with the notes. But yeah, so my what I was thinking about when I prompted that image was the Orion capsule because of SOS, and I was looking at some interior photographs of the capsule, and frankly being pretty disappointed. And we get straight away into discussions about architecture versus engineering and the quality of the space that people are expected to inhabit for any period of time. And straight away, my mind, as it always does in these situations, raced to the work of Galina Balashova that you talked about on the show before, the Russian architect who was involved in designing much of the interiors of the Soyuz and Mir work, and generated a beautiful body of work of watercolors and drawings illustrating the interiors, but critically brought an architectural and interior design ability to the table. I thought very carefully about the design and finish quality of the spaces that astronauts might be expected to live in. So the prompt then for the AI became illustrate the interior of the Orion capsule in the style of a Galina Balashova watercolor. And it felt like what could have been almost. I don't know. Have you seen a picture of the inside of the Orion capsule?
Well, I have, and my question to you is: as an architect, are you impressed by the interiors of the Orion capsule? But before we go on, if anyone who wonders what the Orion capsule is, imagine the moon landings with the moon capsule that went to and did the moon landings. This is the new version of that. This is NASA's new version of that for the moon landings that supposedly are taking place not that long from now. Although the Orion capsule itself won't go down to the moon. That it can only get to the gateway around the moon. So it's basically a ferry to take the astronauts to and from the gateway. So it will come back to Earth and drop in the ocean. So it's a big version of the old moon capsule, not too different in design, but yeah, looking at the interior, are you impressed as an architect? Is that something that Galina would have drawn?
There's an awful lot of things to bang your head on. That was my first reaction. It sounds like a crude summary, but in such a compact, tight space with a number of people floating around in zero gravity, the interior finishes, the positioning of objects and seating and things, I'm sure have all been absolutely wrung out from an ergonomics and efficiency point of view. But it looked like an unpleasant space to be in, and it looked like a space to be in that would at times be awkward to move around in because of the way the interior finishes were very varied and at times projected in unexpected, unusual ways, just because they were just engineered solutions to maximize the efficiency of the seat or the screen position, etc. Certainly looks very different to the interior of the Crew Dragon work by SpaceX.
Well, absolutely, which is sort of gone for that sort of futuristic. Let's it. But I mean, when you're designing the cockpit of an aircraft, for example, do you know of any aircraft that sort of take that architectural flair into consideration, or do they all have functional cockpits? Is the cockpit just there to be functional?
I think that they're all, I'm sure, just functional. I think but the line we start to cross with this work with Orion is when we start to imagine it as a space that has to be inhabited for long periods of time, for a period of time that involves you having to engage with ablutions and sanitary issues, and privacy issues and sleep. Very human experiences, as opposed to just functioning as a pilot for an 8-hour.
Well, of course, this will be the first time that you'll have men and women traveling to the moon. It'll be the first time that women have gone beyond low Earth orbit.
Right.
If they are to travel I mean, actually, that's a good point. Whether Orion is going to beat Starship into being the first time that a woman escapes low Earth orbit. So. Yeah. But I'm kind of thinking it's got to be Orion that's going to do that. But
surely.
Surely,
short
but
of some catastrophic.
I can't feeling that virtually the rest of my sort of podcasting and YouTubing friends probably don't think so. I think they probably think it's going to be Starship that's going to do that. But I think that seems improbable. But
I think we have to hope that it's SLS, just to be optimistic and positive about the amount of time and money that's been spent on that thing so far.
Yeah. So maybe, but there's an awful lot of things to happen before that happens, and that's things like building a gateway. Although they are, I guess, they are going to send. They're going to do an Apollo 8 style mission, aren't they, and send people around in an Orion and back again. Yeah. Which will.
So I think from what I've read, there's into orbit, there's around the moon, and then there's further out than that, which is described, certainly on the Wikipedia page or something, as the first test of a reasonable period of time and distance in this capsule. And that's when I think it starts to get interesting from a materials point of view and an habitation point of view, because you're having to live in that space for probably weeks.
I mean, remember, this was sold as a bit of a as the Mars. It wasn't that long ago that it was the Mars architecture. It was part of the Mars architecture, the Orion capsule. Obviously it was going to have to go with some form of habitation module as well.
So just checking that question of length of time. I think it's expected to last up to 21 days undocked, or 6 months connected to another module like Deep Space Habitat. It's one of the statements I've read. So 21 days.
Yeah, 21 days. 21 days in something like that. I mean, with fellow human beings, sanitary issues, people of the opposite sex.
Yeah, massively changed. So just to give this some context, let's have a think about the size of this thing. Okay, so I had a quick look at how big the Orion capsule was, just to describe it, give people some imagine this thing. So the Orion capsule is 5 meters wide. Okay. Now that's where you think, right, this thing's big, because that, I think, that's a pretty wide fairing compared to anything else.
Yeah.
I think a 4 meter wide fairing usually is pretty much the limits that we've thus far used. So it's 5 meters wide at its base. It's intended for 4 to 6 people, but it has an internal cubic capacity of 9 cubic meters. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's look at that compared to some other ones. How big do you reckon the Apollo command module was?
So that's 9 cubic meters.
So Orion's 9 cubic meters of internal habitable volume. Okay, how big do you reckon the Apollo?
6 cubic meters.
Pretty good. 5.9.
Oof.
Okay.
I think I get the points there.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll round that up. So Crew Dragon is 9.3.
Whoa. Oh, okay. So it's actually, so there's more space internally in a Crew Dragon than in Orion. Wow.
Apparently so, according to the stats I've been trying to compare and look up. Anybody who wants to check me on that, please write in. But take a moment to think about some of the folks who spent time in the Soyuz and Gemini capsules.
Oof. Yeah,
okay.
I mean, but they're ridiculous, aren't they? I mean, they are.
Shout out to Helen Sean. 4 cubic meters for Soyuz.
Even that seems so. When you see them in the Soyuz, and there's 3 of them, and it seems particularly cramped. Apollo's like only 50% bigger, and then it's 30% bigger on top of that for.
Yeah. I think the descent module even smaller. I think the descent module really small at 2.2 actually.
Oh Jesus! Yeah. So
and Gemini 2.5.
I mean, it's considerably bigger. I mean, it's bigger, but it's still 21 days in something that big. I mean, that's
21 days. Four people inside a 9 cubic meter space.
So that must be smaller than, say, a submarine crew or even a prisoner, right?
That's an interesting comparison. Yeah. And then final one, just to give it some context, is apparently the New Shepard capsule is 15 cubic meters. Now, obviously, they're doing a different thing.
Yeah.
But in terms of visual images and people, from the images you've seen,
God,
Shatner, high five and everybody,
and of course, there's no cockpit buttons and screens and everything to get in your way, and there's big windows, so that the whole experience is going to be quite nice, isn't it, for your Shatners and etc. But
so it seems to me that these things matter because it's such a confined, compact space. 21 days inside 9 cubic meters, you can't decide these things. Well, I mean, from some of the things I've read, they are, of course, engaging with these questions. These aren't ignored. There's some of the quotes I've got here. We've got window shades and sleeping bags, built-in shrouds around windows to allow them to take pictures from deep space without glare from the cabin light. So that the window and the importance of the image, we've talked about a lot as part of that. So the sleeping bags have been streamlined to reduce the mass. So this is, the level of detail. They're only to carry up during the launch. It can be hung in several different places through the cabin. So, but 9 cubic meters, but you can at least hang your sleeping bag in a few different places.
It's like being a bat, isn't it? It's just, I'm just going to go to sleep here and sort of just stuff yourself in a. That is pretty.
The sleeping bags apparently have armholes, so crew can use their tablets before they go to sleep. That's quite cute.
Oh, that's conducive to a nice night's sleep, I find, using your tablet just before you go to bed.
You can check out the Interplanetary podcast Instagram before you go to sleep. So that's
currently dominated by AI influenced artwork. Yeah. That's horrible. I mean, just to reiterate the fact that in Apollo 8, in there, there's quite a bit of dialogue about bits of poo floating around. Around the capsule and them deny, oh, that's not mine. It's not sticky enough, stuff like that. So it's beautiful. You think, oh my God, it could be an absolutely gross environment, and it's 50 years later and it's not much better. It doesn't feel like Star Trek just yet, does it?
Not quite. So 50 years later, we've added 3 cubic meters, and you can hang your sleeping bags up. I mean, I'm quite sure if any Orion engineers are listening, they're going to probably hunt me down.
I mean. Yeah, imagine that thing of, oh, when we go to the moon, we're going to take a car with us as well. That would seem incredible now, wouldn't it? But they actually did that, by the way.
Yeah.
I know, just blows my mind still.
Yeah. So for me, I wanted to have a quick chat about Orion because SLS is an incredible step forward, I'm sure, for NASA, and the rocket launch will be huge news in the space sector, but it's Orion that catches
it is actually suddenly upon us, isn't it? The SLS, and I think it's kind of taken everyone by surprise. I'm supposed to be on off nominal with my friends Jake and Anthony from Miko and We Martians. They have this kind of spin-off episode, so it's worth checking out. I join them once every year or so. But they put me back because SLS was brought forward of all things. Obviously, SLS is huge if you're an American. I mean, it's pretty big. It's pretty big for us, but I mean, it almost seems improbable. I think that even Eric Berger was sort of saying that he wasn't really sure he was ever going to get to say SLS is on the launch pad, and here we are, and it's. I'm on holiday, but I'm going to try and watch it. And hopefully this podcast is out before it comes out, because we've got to get this out slightly early, because we've got to do a shout out for our guests and their Martian habitat in Bristol that we went to visit. And so I think we should talk about that. So we had a little trip, didn't we, last week, Rob? It was the first time.
We did. Road trip.
First time I ever saw you in the flesh, which actually seems quite hard to believe. I actually had to question whether that was actually true.
Well, a pleasure to be able to take that step and come out and go on the road with you and take a look at the pieces as a patron of the podcast for a while now.
Yeah.
So thank you for inviting me along.
It was absolutely my pleasure. You've stepped up to co-host in Linn's absence.
Those are big shoes to fill.
Yeah. So she's back next month, but she's not around this month. It is always brilliant having you on. What was good about this is I got to listen back to the podcast that we'd done on Martian architecture before, and I learned.
You probably had to put aside about a week to listen.
Yeah, well, it was a 2-hour drive, almost exactly from London to Bristol, and they did it filled that exact drive up, one episode of the podcast. So it was.
I feel like I should apologise to listeners that I always end up making long episodes with you, wittering on.
So so let's. It was amazing actually. When I first saw that Martian habitat in the centre of Bristol, because I've been to Bristol a few times, so I knew that little bit quite well. And when you see it there, it's like, oh wow, it's there. That's what we were talking about, and they've actually managed to do it, which I think is, a bit like SLS. I wasn't, it's one of those things where you have people on the show and you're not quite sure whether it's going to happen. I'd have put it down as a 50-50, but they actually made it happen. And it's really impressive.
Well, you'll obviously in the interview, I did take a bit of time to congratulate him, because I can't underestimate how tough it's been to get stuff built in the UK the last sort of 12 to 18 months for obvious reasons. So just getting it finished is to be commended, surely. And I think they've achieved what they told us they hoped to achieve when they first spoke to us. Whatever, a year ago now?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Well, it was March. Well over a year ago. Yeah, and it's
So if folks want to hear the intro, they can go back and listen to that epic episode last year.
Yeah, but what's interesting about that as well is that for them is a hugely long journey. It feels like the kind of journey that people in the space world are quite used to making very long commitments to things. Like, imagine the people involved with SLS. That is. Like the first launch is going to be decades after the thing is first really kind of thought about. It's like, wow. Yeah. So if you're
putting big chunks of your career into something, I think, incredible. It's taken them 7 years from inception to delivery, and they've stuck it out and delivered it. So amazing work.
And true to the form of artists, it's not like they're getting paid a lot of money to do it. It's not like NASA are giving them a salary to do this thing either. So it's a phenomenal achievement, and obviously takes a lot of willpower, particularly as one of them is a young parent as well. So that's it's just unbelievable, really. Well, we'll go on to that interview. Before we get to that interview, though, I want to play another interview first, which is I happened to catch up. I got an email from Owen Madge, who is from the Steel River Rocketeers up north England, sort of Newcastle-y kind of way. He was talking about one of my favourite sort of concepts, which is to launch from a balloon, which is called a Rocoon.
Beautiful.
A rocket from a balloon. Or Rocoon. And he's in a race. He's in a race with Sir Richard Branson, of course, because Sir Richard Branson might be the first person to fly something out of the UK that goes into space above the Kármán line.
Yep.
So might our friends over at Orbex as well.
Yep.
So might Skyroarer. But so might this bunch of researchers and students and rocket enthusiasts who've got this little club, and they're trying to build a something that will go over the Kármán line, and it launches from a balloon. And so I thought this is like the absolute opposite end of the spectrum of SLS. So I thought I'd put in a quick little interview, and I really like it. Sounds great. He's a really good guy, and he reached out. So
I'll even before I hear the interview, I think I'm going to be rooting for the Rocoon.
Yeah. Well,
got to support the underdog.
You always, as an Englishman, you have to support the underdog at all times. Yes, and Dickie Pickles, and this particular instance isn't the underdog. No. He's the overdog. Right. So here is
go Rocoon.
Yeah. So here is my interview with Owen.
The Interplanetary podcast, putting the ace back into space.
So I am joined on the podcast by Owen from Steel River Rocketeers. Welcome to the podcast, Owen.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's great to be on.
Good. Whereabouts in the world are you?
I'm currently in Spennymoor, so northeast England.
A bit of an undiscovered part of the world for most of our listeners, I'd imagine. But
full of natural beauty.
Full of natural beauty. It really is. It's a beautiful part of the world. You asked to come on the podcast, and I think it is a really, really interesting project that you've got going. But before we get onto the sort of project that's coming up, tell us a little bit about the Steel River Rocketeers.
Oh, yeah, of course. So Steel River Rocketeers, it's basically a student-led launch vehicle development program, and our main goals at the moment are to educate people in the region, inspire any sort of work into space, and showcase the diverse skill sets that the region has to offer. We're mainly working within Teesside and the surrounding area in the northeast, but we've started working all the way across the UK now. And we've had a variety of members in the past, not all of which have been students, but all of them have had an extreme interest in engineering and a very keen willingness to learn, which is the main thing that we require on the program.
Indeed. So, yeah, well, tell us a little bit about your latest project and some of the sort of milestones that you've already reached and the ones that you hope to do later.
Yeah, of course. So the latest project that we're working on, well, overall, we're working towards our developmental launch vehicle, which is SR1 or Steel River 1. SR1 is a little Rocoon, so a rocket and balloon combination, and it's composed of a 1,000-gram natural latex rubber balloon, meteorological balloon, and an inbuilt stabilized launch pad, or we like to call it the cup. And then that carries a small rocket, no larger than an A4 sheet of paper, which is powered by an APCP fuel grain. The rocket launches at 30 kilometers from inside of the balloon above the ocean, and only if all of the launch conditions are met. So we have a lot of different electronics on the launch pad, on the rocket, for example, to check up a lot of pre-flight conditions. So one thing about the rocket is that we use gyroscopic stabilization, because obviously launching at such a high altitude, you'd need to accelerate to a very high speed to have any sort of stabilization from just fins. So we like to use gyroscopic stabilization just to get that initial stabilized bit of flight there. So one of the conditions, for example, is to make sure that the rocket isn't wobbling on its spin-up mechanism while it's rotating at about 20 rotations per second. So as long as that one condition, and then obviously a few other conditions, one of which being that it's pointing vertically upwards. Once those conditions are met, the rocket then launches from the 30 kilometers, bursts through the skin of the balloon with its needle skin tip, accelerates to Mach 5 within a 7-second motor burn, and then this will hopefully achieve apogee above the 100-kilometer Kármán line.
So yeah, it is. Yeah, so it's a suborbital launch, isn't it?
It is, yeah, ballistic trajectory suborbital launch.
Yeah, so I mean, just as a little bit of background for some of the listeners who aren't super clued up, and I do love the name Rocoon, and this has definitely been one of my. I've always been really interested in this idea of launching rockets from balloons, and I suppose you're in a kind of race with another rocket launch system. That avoids the rocket equation for a large proportion of the flight. So it avoids the trying to get off the ground. Because, I mean, just to put it as bluntly as possible, a rocket carries all the fuel that it uses, and which makes it kind of a bit annoying, because most of the fuel it uses is to carry the fuel that it needs to use later on. Exactly. So you've got round this by using a balloon to carry up to a certain altitude, but you're in a race with old Dickie Pickles at Virgin Orbit, who uses a jumbo jet to carry his rocket to a certain altitude. But the scale is somewhat different, isn't there? Is there a sort of scale? Is there a scale constraint on the Rocoon style rocket? Do you know?
Well, effectively, your main constraint is the balloon that you can use. So I've seen recently NASA's experimentation with a lot of superpressure balloons taking up quite high weighted payloads, and obviously the more pressure your balloon can support and the bigger it can get, the higher payload you can take. So ideally, if you're talking for an orbital payload, something like that, where you need a significant second stage to be able to drop it off into orbit, you'd be talking probably much larger balloon than what we're using now. If not, I suppose you could probably use more than one balloon if you're willing to suspend the package from below. But our system currently, it sits actually inside of the balloon. So the cup is effectively a sort of stopper on the bottom of the balloon neck, and then launches from inside, which offers a few more advantages to a normal ground launch. As you say, Dickie Pickles is off with his jumbo jet, but with it being inside of a balloon, we can launch in the vast majority of weather conditions, because obviously, since we're coasting up to 30 kilometers of altitude before we actually launch, up in the stratosphere, the vast majority of weather conditions are completely mitigated. So it's quite a robust system that can launch at quite a lot of different times, and I'm hoping that if something causes Dickie Pickles to get a little scrub in there, we might be able to run in under his nose and grab the title away from him.
Well, yeah, and that title up for grabs is the first people to go above the Kármán line launching from the United Kingdom, right?
Yep, that's exactly right, from the UK mainland. We're also aiming for the first student group to be able to independently verify that we've passed the Kármán line. I believe
would that be globally? And that would be globally.
Yeah, I believe so. There was a student team in the US that managed to pass the Kármán line, but that was not independently verified. So I think that they did manage to pass it, but obviously no one's sure. So if we could do it, then we would be the first verified space flight from an all student team. Yeah,
well, that would be an achievement in itself, wouldn't it? So what's the gas inside the balloon?
Helium at the minute. We're using helium mainly because it's inert and it just simplifies a lot of the launching a rocket engine from inside of a gaseous atmosphere. It simplifies a lot of the issues, but obviously with it being a scarce resource, we are looking at converting over to hydrogen in future. But as I say, it's got a lot of disadvantages compared to helium when it comes to its inertness, if you will. But yeah, as I say, less scarce, so a lot cheaper, a lot easier.
I guess if you've got electronic systems or things spinning up, any spark or friction sets the whole thing on fire. If it's hydrogen, exactly. Is that the thinking basically?
It is, yeah. I mean, it's possible to if the rocket were to ignite in a hydrogen atmosphere, it's possible that the brief amount of time that it would be in there would be acceptable to not alter the rocket's trajectory. But it's playing with fire in a literal sense, so yeah, we're not 100% sure yet. But more testing in the future, and we'll see if we can get to something hydrogen based instead of helium.
And what sort of milestones have you done so far with this particular launch system?
Well, we've achieved a fair bit so far. One of the things that we focus on is educational outreach. So we've been working quite a lot with the students at Eaglescliff School on our model rocket flights. These are basically just different staged flights trying to get different altitude milestones up to 1 mile from the ground, because that is a rough equivalent of the engine grain that we'll be launching at 30 kilometers. Interestingly enough, if we launched our 30-kilometer engine from the ground, it would only reach about 1.6 kilometers of altitude, whereas launching it from 30 kilometers, it actually enables it to reach an extra 72 kilometers of altitude. So hopefully 102. Yeah.
Is that presumably that's all just down to atmospheric drag?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, stratosphere, you're above 99% of the atmosphere, and with the lesson of drag, the lesson of necessary propellant. So it allows us to have a very, very light launch vehicle, and also the possibility for scalability in the future.
Yeah, and presumably the actual rocket itself doesn't need to be so robust because it's not reaching such high temperatures and max Q and all those elements.
Yeah, exactly. That's another thing. I mean, the aeroframe that we're currently using is a 3D printed. I believe it's either PLA or ABS. I'm not 100% sure on that. But just a 3D printed plastic aeroframe, which obviously wouldn't be great from a ground launch perspective when you hit max Q and pressures such as that.
And of course, the fairing has dual use because the fairing itself, you're saying, actually pins the balloon and bursts the balloon on its way through.
It does, yeah. It will have a pin extruded from the top of the fairing, so that'll contact the skin and then pop the balloon as it launches. And we've done a lot of testing on the ground for this as well as like other various tests. I think we're up to about 20 different balloon flights now. We've done, the first test that I was involved with was the Micro Mars payload test, where we launched a payload suspended from a balloon. That worked very well. We recovered it out of a tree from a parachute. To be honest, it took embarrassingly long for a group of engineers to figure out how to make a longer stick out of two long sticks. But we got there in the end. A couple of shoelaces were involved, but we got there. And as you say, the penetration tests we've done on the ground as well, and all sorts of different power ratios we've done for motors, and we've not seen any sort of significant deflection from that either. So just because it's the balloon skin so taut when the pin impacts it, it just retreats straight away from the pin and doesn't create much friction.
Yeah, and I guess someone might be asking, why not just ride the balloon all the way into space?
Well, yeah. I mean, that would be an ideal world, but obviously, once you get above a certain atmospheric pressure, the balloon expands to a rate at which it can't contain the pressure within it. let alone that balloons work on a buoyancy principle. So once you've escaped the atmosphere, you've no longer got a fluid to become buoyant in. So there's a limit to the height that you can reach with a balloon. Yeah,
it's just always so pesky, isn't it, to get off the Earth? Everything seems to go against you. So, what's the desired? What sort of payloads are we talking about here for this rocket?
Currently, for the Steel River 1 rocket, we'll be taking up a bit of a simplified payload. So it'll be mainly made up of a GPS module, a few transceivers for communication, and a HD camera for capturing the flight itself, which obviously with using gyroscopic stabilization will be a little bit spinny to start with. But hopefully once it's no longer in powered flight and it's climbing to apogee over the course of 2 minutes, the air resistance, or at least what's left of the air resistance, will hopefully slow the spin down. But the payload that we're hoping to take up on later flights, suborbital flights, would be the ThumbSat module that our mentor and chiefs created. It's a small CubeSat platform that's below 14 grams in weight, and then you can take upwards of about a 25 gram payload on top of that. So the end flights, once we've actually achieved space and we're starting to drop off packages for experimental use, those will be of around that order of payload. But the rocket that we're using for SR1, I believe the dry weight payload is 160 gram dry mass and 200 gram fuel weights for a total of 360 grams.
And that's the whole system.
That's the whole rocket. So weighs less than a Coke can, actually.
Yeah. So it's So give us some sort of idea of size. Is it like a sort of Coke can in size?
Yeah, I mean, roughly, we're talking less than the size of an A4 piece of paper, so around the length of a 2B pencil. It's quite a small, very small rocket, but it's quite advanced for a solid rocket. It's got a complete aluminium motor house and motor case, and it's got a vacuum expanded nozzle, so it's designed for vacuum flight. So obviously no thrust whatsoever on the ground, but perfect up at 30 kilometers altitude. But yeah, it's quite an interesting little rocket, to be honest, for basically being a model.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about your mentor then. Is this Sean Whitehead? Is that the guy?
It is. So I'll just give you a little bit of background first. So Steel River Rocketeers is kind of three groups working together. You've got ThumbSat over in Mexico. You've got Scoutech, in the UK, and then of course SRR in the sort of Teesside area in the UK. ThumbSat is the group responsible for the design and production of our femto satellites, ground stations, and most of the software that we use. It's mainly designed and built by Dr. Antonio Hernandez, who works in our clean room production facilities in Mexico. Scoutech is Sean Whitehead's personal R&D company. All of this has been started by Sean, but his primary involvement, I would say, is in his R&D company. And that's the group responsible for the manufacture of most of our hardware, such as the motor casing and nozzle. And then, of course, there's SRR, which is the student team responsible for taking all of these parts, putting them together, and flying research missions, ultimately with the goal of reaching space. But he's done a lot of work in the past, ranging from working on the Beagle 2 Mars lander, or some instruments that were on the Beagle 2 Mars lander for the British Interplanetary Society. And he's also worked on projects including robotics, exploring the chambers in the Great Pyramids. He's also been working on a project to place a sculpture on the lunar surface. And the latter of these projects was kind of presented him with an issue, which was how do I cheaply and reliably test a small sample of material that I want to use for the sculpture in a high energy particle vacuum environment. Obviously, in order to do this, a CubeSat would be the best sort of choice. But with the current launch programs and the launchability of CubeSats, you've got to look at a rideshare. Rideshare is very expensive and a large wait time as well. So it just became very obvious to him that there was a massive market out there and a need for this sort of low cost, low fuss and short weight launch system. So that's basically what we're doing here, is trying to create a launch system where we do the paperwork, we launch the rocket, All the customer has to do is provide an experiment that fits within the mass budget and works with the ThumbSat satellite bus.
So I would assume then. So the overall goal is to get things into orbit, which obviously requires a little bit more delta V, a little bit more thrust to get things into orbit. You'd need to, presumably for testing materials against radiation, you'd have to maintain some form of orbit for it to have 100%. Any kind a reasonable time exposed to that radiation.
Definitely. So the flights that we're using at the minute are about 8 minutes of microgravity time. But then obviously there'll only be about 30 seconds to a minute of that above the Kármán line. So exposed to that sort of high energy environment, it's not going to happen on a suborbital flight really. So we are aiming for orbit in future, but as you say, it's quite a significant jump. So it'll take a little while past getting the space shot out of the way. But no, I mean, as I say, the system's very scalable. If we add another balloon, for example, you've got double the payload weight. Realistically, we're well below the payload limit of the balloon that we're even using at the moment. So realistically, it's very possible that we could get orbit quite soon after the fact. I mean, I say soon and long at the same sentence, but I'm hoping for the latter. I'm hoping for it to be as quick as possible.
Yeah, well, obviously, in what I've noticed in the world of rockets is everything happens much quicker than everyone thought.
Yeah, exactly.
Not so. Yeah, so it's always. I mean, let's face it. It's incredibly difficult to get things up to the Kármán line. I don't think anyone other than rocket scientists really appreciate just how difficult it is. It's a common question that I always get is, why don't we go to the moon all the time? It's like, well, because it's insanely difficult. And so I absolutely wish you all the luck in the world. I kind of am rooting for you in a way to beat Dickie Pickles or Orbex or Skyrora to be the first people to launch from an orbital launch from the UK. It'd be absolutely brilliant. But what an exciting time, that we might see over the next couple of years. Quite a few different methods of getting above the Kármán line by lots of different from the UK. I mean, who would have thought?
We've got the horizontal launch facilities being built up, got the vertical launch facilities. It's going to be quite an exciting time to be walking about the island like.
Yeah, it's quite a good time to be an interplanetary podcaster.
It is, it is.
I'm winding myself up for it. Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much for coming on the program. But where can people go and check this out? And have you got a call to action?
Of course. So we really are trying hard to accelerate the launch date to get this space shot out of the way. But obviously, the best way to do that is more hands on deck. And we've had a little bit of trouble with colleagues throughout the pandemic and such. So we are looking to get as many applicants in as we can. As got plenty of room for recruitment. So if anybody's interested, you can find out more information at www.steelriver.space. If you scroll down to the bottom of the page there's an application form and you can fill that out. Or you can just email me directly. That's Owen, steelriverspace@gmail.com. And just to specify, it's OWAIN. steelriverspace@gmail.com.
Well, thanks very much for joining me on the podcast, and I wish you all the luck, and I'm sure the Spodcats will too.
Thank you very much. No, it's been a pleasure being on, Matt. Nice to speak to you.
You're listening to the Interplanetary podcast, putting the ace back into space.
There you go. That's the weird concept of launching a very, very small rocket, and it's only you have to see the pictures, Rob, because it's just a little bit bigger than a Coke can.
Sounds amazing.
It is.
I'm going to have to take a proper look at it.
God, if they manage to do it, it will be absolutely awesome. That whole idea that there'd be the first sort of volunteer group or sort of amateur group to get over the Kármán line as well would be pretty phenomenal. So there must be a bit of a rush on around the world for that as well, I would have thought.
Yeah, and only being the size of a Coke can, they'll probably be spared idiots like me complaining about the quality of the interior. As well, anyway, tell me about your decor.
Yeah, I did see inside. It was a little bit. If you were an ant, you'd be pretty disappointed with your accommodation.
Yeah. Okay, so a few slightly less cubic meters than the Orion capsule. Then.
I guess this is the ham part of the ham and cheese sandwich of interviews this week. It's the interview with Nicki and Ella from the Martian House Project, who we had on over a year and a half ago. And this
well, previously we spoke to Nicki and Owen, didn't we? Owen Pierce from Pierce Plus, the architect. Unfortunately, Owen couldn't join us for this interview, but it was great to hear this time from Nicki's colleague Ella as well, and to get the two main protagonists on the podcast.
Yeah, it's some confusion there about the Owens that we're having on the podcast.
Too many Owens.
Too many Owens. So yeah, here is that interview. Écoutez.
The Interplanetary podcast is alive!
All right, well, welcome, Ella and Nicki, to the Interplanetary podcast. Thanks for returning to talk to us about the launch and arrival of your Martian House. Thanks for inviting us down to your event last week. It was great to see it being completed. And first of all, I want to just sort of congratulate you on getting it done and grappling with what seemed like a huge team of people. It looks like you had to pull in support and favours and assistance from all manner of folks. So that seemed like a huge task. So well done. Possibly a bit like what it would be like to deliver the actual thing with a huge team, I imagine.
Yeah. That's what we always kind of said. Like years and years ago when we set out, we read about like, we're just interested in space and space missions, and there's always this sense that like, it's such a feat and there's so many people involved. So we always had this idea that like ours, in a small way would be like a little bit similar. Like it really take a lot of people to get it off the ground. And it was nice at our launch the other day because we got all of those people together in a room, and there were a couple of hundred people there, and really everyone had contributed in some way, whether it was like bigger roles like the structural engineers or like the carpenters that were actually on site, or the guy that was our site manager and the architects, but through to people who are now going to volunteer their time to make the interiors, and also just, friends who like helped, with various smaller jobs for free.
Well, collaboration was a big part of the discussion that we had a lot on the previous podcast, looking at this topic of inhabiting Mars and teamwork. And if I remember right, NASA had something like about 500,000 people working for it in the late 60s, if I remember the numbers right. And it felt like you were probably up at those sorts of numbers almost. So well done.
Thanks.
So you want to tell us a bit about what the key challenges were, perhaps, in terms of, I'd be interested in what was learned during design development in relation to the conversations you were having with the guys at University of Bristol around Martian challenges and technical challenges, and how that shaped the final design. I think you mentioned in the presentation that Owen had undertaken a lot of work to help deliver the project, and I'd be interested to hear about your thoughts on what challenges he was faced to try and make it a tangible, as realistic as possible experience in that respect. So tell us about the input that you had, perhaps from the University of Bristol guys.
Yeah, so they advised on the project and advising on things like how the house would protect someone that would live in it. So so the design, including that, thinking about stuff like the lower floor would be built underground, probably in the lava tubes that already exist on Mars to protect you from the radiation, and then the top floor being inflated on arrival and then filled with the Martian regolith to create thick walls. Yeah. And then really the conversation about how someone might live in the house, because we put these big windows on the top floor, and then being the big windows being a point where radiation could come into the house.
Yeah, we were wondering that on site, actually.
Yeah, we had a lot of conversations about that. There are some louvres on there to help that. And then we spoke a lot about the ceiling window would be filled with water that would be a separate store for water, and then also would be turned to ice to protect you from radiation. But also, being in the top floor, you couldn't be in there all the time. Yeah. If there was a solar storm, you'd need to go underground. Okay. So kind of talking to Bob and Lucy about the practicalities of that, that you could spend some time up there and then back. That's why you'd sleep under the ground, where you'd definitely be away from the radiation.
Yeah, it was quite interesting, like, you know, that conversation with them is about like the trade-off between, you know, that like engineering principles, how you would protect yourself, but the trade-off between, but how would you want to live? How would you protect yourself, like protect your own well-being? And you just couldn't live without a window.
Yeah. I mean, that was one theme that keeps coming up a time and time again when I've had Rob on as the co-host, is this theme of engineers wanting, particularly with something like space and with Mars, always wanting the simplest and the lightest of, often, of course, because you've got to take this stuff to Mars solution, and often that means forgetting about the human element of having a window. And of course, you know, if the engineers had their way, there would be no window on the International Space Station. So I mean, that it's a theme that comes up absolutely loads, and I kind of guess that's Rob's job almost as an architect is that tightrope between human need and engineering need, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. I think that debate was evident and manifested itself in your design in the final piece. It was really interesting. I think, Matt, we're probably going to get emails now from engineers, no doubt, having raised that complaint again. But I think I'm really interested in how those technical challenges aren't just technical issues to be overcome, but they are things that shape your experience and movement around the house at different times of day or different times of Martian year, almost, or between storms and calm periods.
How
we inhabit a space is seasonal on here on Earth, and could equally be seasonal in a sense on Mars too.
Yeah, like you wouldn't spend all your time upstairs in our house.
Yeah. Unless you wanted a tan.
Wow.
A dangerous tan, yeah. Louvers on windows, we've got ice or water in openings as well. And then, of course, the other key space you got up there was the hydroponics. A really interesting project. What's the goals and the hope of that particular project? For Katie Connor working on that?
Yeah, that's Katie Connor. So she's an artist in Bristol who's working with some botanists at the university as part of a funded project by the Brigstow Institute. The title of the project is called How to Grow Livable Worlds. So again, like her work it is that kind of balance between like functionality and well-being. So it's dealing with a lot of similar questions, which is why we really wanted her to work on the hydroponics, because it can be quite a sterile kind of approach to growing plants and interaction with plants. So it's looking at it in a bit of a different way. It's looking at the sensory properties of plants as well as their functionality and how the plants make you feel. And that's what her research really is about. Not just, I mean, she is, you know, really growing the plants hydroponically, and that in itself is very experimental. So it's similar. There's the real science there, but there's also the well-being side of things that she's researching and exploring.
So is that shaping workshops that you're doing with the public?
Yeah, so she's doing some workshops that she'll run herself, where people can come and interact with the plants. And the focus of the research is more about how the plants make you feel. She's inviting people to take part in like a tea drinking ceremony with using herbs from the plants and be amongst them and kind of talk about their experiences and how that might be different to plants on Earth. Or it's a kind of place to reconsider our relationship to plants in the same way that we're using the house to reconsider our relationship to all of the objects of everyday living. Her work is about reconsidering our relationship to plants in a similar way.
Right. It's really interesting. When you say tea drinking ceremonies, my mind races to Japanese tea drinking ceremonies. and its relationship to room layout and architecture as well, as a communal collective thing again.
There's even an English equivalent to that, isn't there? Really, essentially,
yes.
It's just probably seems less ceremonial, but it probably is just as much. And I guess that does reinforce that whole idea of there are certain things that are mundane in life that you kind of still need, and I got a sense of that through the when we had a look round, like even just seeing like, you know, a recognizable toilet or a shower mechanism and things like that is kind of important, isn't it?
Yeah, and some of those things we hope to kind of change. Maybe the shower might change whilst it's there. We don't know. The toilet won't be changing, I don't think, but the shower, we could change it and take the head off and see if we try to make something a bit that uses a bit less water, maybe. I guess that's the thing as well. We want it to really be changing and experiments and new ideas of living, as well as those things that we really recognise.
Have you got a list of things that you kind of want to achieve like that, in terms of the experiments that you want to run, the kind of workshopy things that you want to run, to see if you can sort of generate some information? I guess
it's like you could approach it kind of two ways round. You could kind of start with like, you know, this is missing, we need this, or you could kind of look at it the other way around, which I think is more the way we're approaching it, in that like, well, here is a semi-blank kind of canvas, and what do you think is missing? And that will lead what is made. But I mean, you know, we've got lots of ideas about it, but we're trying to let it be quite led by the participants and their interests, really. So we have this call out for the volunteers to get involved in that process, and so many people in Bristol applied. It was so exciting, all of these people who are just thinking about, I guess, kind of future living, but in quite different ways. Like, we had applications from people who are architects or who work in design, but then also just people who were talking about how they make their own hair dyes out of vegetables. So that they're going to approach it. We're kind of holding together and supporting them with what they're making, but it is going to be quite led by them. So it's about, what they think is important to everyday living, and also working together as a group that, you know, they might come to those ideas together as well. So you've kind of provided a platform for like a whole host of other sort of stakeholders or experimentalists, etc., in your area, how sort of broader catchment area are these interested parties? Where are they coming from?
Well, they're all from Bristol, and they're just people who've volunteered. So it's about them joining us to make these experiments and ideas and artifacts to put in the house that help us imagine how people might live in it. And they could be anybody in Bristol who wanted to be part of it. So I guess I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it's what I like about Bristol, actually. I guess for the American listeners, et cetera, it's quite nice to point out that Bristol is that type of city that's full of it's very arty, isn't it? As a city, it's a lot of sort of free thinking. It's probably one of England's sort of freest thinking cities and sort of experimental cities. So it kind of feels as though it's in the right place, at least for that kind of interaction.
Yeah, we did feel people really got the call out. We were really pleased with all of the applications we had, and we felt like we could really choose people who really had enthusiasm to want to be part of it. Someone like, you know, they just wrote stuff like, I've got tools and I'm ready, like type things, like I'm ready to come and make. Or really getting that what we're getting at is also what can we build here and now, and that might look a lot more low tech and simple than people's first instinct for thinking about future living on Mars, because of the project being about living with limited resources, and looking at it through that lens.
Yeah, and I think actually on that point, people seem to really get that message. Like, if you look at the design of the house, it's exactly the same, it's like, well, what can we make out of this idea, this design, but how can we make it here and now on Earth? What would it look like? And who would be involved if we tried to bring it to life? It's the same process really that's designed and built the house.
I have to say, for me, it's absolutely the most sort of successful part of this project is that openness. And you clearly delivered on those goals. I think because it's just such an unusual mindset to be in for this type of project. For a project building some sort of analog that seeks to be technically comparable to the Martian experience, physically comparable, for you to hold to that idea that it should be the blank canvas that you've talked about, I think is very unusual for this type of discussion and debate. And I'm sure going to be the most successful part of it. With the volunteers that you've got coming in, it sounds like you've had a great response. Is that sort of waiting list closed? Or could listeners apply to be involved or offer anything? Or are you already full of ideas and events?
It is closed now. So, it was hard choosing like how to do that. But we thought we would have this call out, and that happened while the house was being built. So, there was that sense of kind of excitement around it and what's it going to be. And then people read the information and volunteered their time. And then we chose from there. But we have been having some, and we wanted to choose the people so that we can really allow ideas to develop over a long time and, really get into some real making. But we did want to allow opportunity as well for people to participate on a bit more of a drop-in kind of basis. So we've been doing a little bit of that over this month, over August, because it's the summer holiday. We had some workshops that were kind of suitable for families, and they've been about making some of the textiles for the house. So we've been making fabrics, personalizing fabrics that might be used for like duvet covers, and we've been using like dyes made from vegetables and printing flowers onto fabrics. So there is a bit of an opportunity there for like a lower commitment way of designing and making in some way.
Is there opportunity or any aspiration for ongoing debates with Hugh Broughton Architects and Owen Pearce and others involved technically? I'd be interested to hear about whether or not there's opportunity for them to reflect on the spatial arrangement of the house as it responds to these workshops and inputs, and whether or not there's a sort of a future iteration could be managed or adjustment. Just reflecting on what we talked about with the tea ceremony. If I was to be in any way critical as an architect of that space, thinking about what you've just described, I wonder about the space's ability to provide space to gather in smaller groups in terms of the way the room sizes work and layouts. So I'll be interested to know whether or not the scope for ongoing reflection from the likes of Hugh Broughton and Owen. Do you think that's possible?
Well, we are doing an event, which is a panel discussion event on the 1st of September at MShed, that will include the architects. And right. I think I'd hope there'd be discussion about that type of thing. Beyond the project that's happening now and the changes like that, it's just, at this point, it's been a massive thing to get to this point. So thinking about...
Yeah, sure.
I guess, when we get to the end... I think, we will need to take some time for reflection and include the wider design team in reflections on the project as well. We'll make there'll be a short documentary film. So we're documenting conversations that are happening, and that will form part of how we reflect on the experiences and what we've made and learned, I guess. But yeah, that it would be interesting if we particularly made space to reflect on the design and included the design team in that. That's a good idea.
Yeah, obviously we spoke to you, I think it was March 21 that we spoke to you, and so obviously a lot, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. What are the things that have changed since we last spoke to you in terms of the design of the actual object that we now see, the house that we actually see in Bristol, and how you were thinking it was going to look? Is it pretty much how you were imagining it, or has it been radically changed in that since we last spoke to you?
Well, so there was a few things obviously to make it happen, with pretty much everything being donated and the cost of things going up. Some design changes happened to make it possible. And one of them that was quite good is that we got a little workshop space that isn't part of the Martian House, but is a space where we're doing our workshops, and that when people come for a viewing, that it will be the first part of the house that they come into. So that was quite, lucky that happened.
And it was actually like a structural decision that in the end. So there was meant to be the upper floor, which sits on the Martian landscape in the scenario of Mars. It was meant to be like a steel frame, like a kind of modular steel structure, but it was nobody would donate the steel frame because it was too expensive. So this other shipping container was introduced as it was a structural decision. But yeah, it was quite useful because it gave us this workshop space. But it's essentially the same. It's exactly the same concept, really, as you see it from the outside. And actually, I don't think the concept has really changed that much for quite a long time. The inflatable top level of the house really does look quite a lot like the first concept drawings that were made in 2019? Quite a long time ago. Yeah. And and this like compact living space underground. There was meant to be an airlock, and that was omitted in the end.
For it was anyone to make it.
Yeah, we couldn't get anyone to make that part, so it was omitted in the end.
It would be nice if our group wanted to make an airlock, but I don't know if they were too busy on other things.
What was that feeling like when you first saw you on? Because I mean, it's obviously the thing that the real draw to it is the big gold inflatable outside. What was the feeling like when you first saw that in real life and it was up?
That was quite an exciting day. Yeah. Well, when we arrived, it was like the deck was there and the space, and we walked up and we saw it was laid out. And I was a little bit worried. Ella, were you? I was like, it's quite small.
Yeah.
Maybe it will, after all this time, maybe it's not really going to stand out. And then...
like a Spinal Tap moment.
And then when it was being inflated the first time, we were very close to it and stood on the deck watching it inflate. And we were like, okay, looks pretty good, shiny. And then we walked down the steps and stepped back, and then you could really see, wow, it was quite a surprise. Ella, did you feel the same?
Yeah. And then actually, so we were there most of the day, and then as we were leaving, we both walked to the other side of the water, to the other side of the harbour, and then it was the further and further we got away from it, the more you can really see it and see it next to the other buildings, and it's almost better and better the more distance you get on it. So it was a kind of slow burn.
I think what I love about that aspect is the final form in that top section, the inflatable golden dome at the top, is joyful and attractive and appealing and playful as well in its shape and its form. And I think that's a really valuable part of the discussion about what it might be like to live on Martian as well. The visual quality of it, how it sits in the landscape and how it appears, is part of that process of making a home, making a place you're proud to live in or want to inhabit.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a really nice description of it. And that's like kind of grown on me as well, I think. Actually, like lots of people have just been like emailing us like general kind of comments or questions and things. And somebody did email a week or so ago just saying like, I love walking past this, like maybe they live nearby, and they said like it fills me with joy. I really like it. And I think that is a really nice description. It is a joyful, like kind of structure. There is something, like playful and quite friendly about it. Mm-hmm. And that is quite a different look to some space design or, some kind of future living kind of architecture. It is quite different, and that's nice.
I was quite surprised how quickly the seagulls had sort of decided that it was fine. They can land on it.
Yeah, I was worried about the seagulls to begin with. After it went up, I think I did say to Nikki, "What if a seagull like pecks it and pops it?"
Yeah. It's one part of the analog that doesn't quite work, does it? It's not a direct comparison with the Martian.
Apparently there are no seagulls on Mars, which I find hard to believe. Did you at any point think that you should fill it full of regolith? I noticed obviously you've got big heavy sandbags to hold the thing down in wind, but did you ever think about
years ago, like literally years ago, I do remember talking about that in design team meetings, and we kept saying like, no, we've got to actually fill it, haven't we? And the architects were like, no, like we're not, you can't, you'll be able to reuse it if you don't do that. And also, just how are we going to do that kind of thing? And I think now that it's there, I don't see how that could have happened really. And then you really, if you'd done that, you would really have been making a permanent building, which we haven't made. It is a temporary structure. If it was filled with like some sort of Mars substitute solidified concrete, we wouldn't ever take it down.
In terms of the way that you've built it, obviously you've built it out of necessity to be a temporary building. It's not like you can't just go plonking Mars houses in the middle of Bristol. Is that in some ways, does that add to the realism of it? Because I can imagine that something like that, you wouldn't want to necessarily, you're kind of building in more of that way, having more of that mindset that it's probably only going to be temporary in terms of particularly the sort of upper structures.
Well, you mean that the nature of a temporary structure is appropriate?
Well, I mean, you can probably describe it better than me, Rob, in terms of the way that you would think about something temporary rather than permanent in the Martian landscape.
It certainly reflects
the Bristol landscape.
The challenges of transporting and packing up and bringing something to the surface. I suppose would need to be lighter weight materials and temporary in a sense.
Yes, that does make sense. I mean, we took in the design process, I remember we did talk quite a lot about the design is based on like those temporary kind of structures in a way, because we talked a lot about like disaster scenarios or like refugee scenarios, and where there's some buildings built in a similar way where you'd have this inflatable kind of formwork or like earth bag structures. So it does kind of borrow from those like quick and relatively temporary way of building.
And I guess for me, what you're saying is really, how do we imagine the people who live in this house on Mars to be living? Are they there temporarily or are they there permanently? And I guess that's also interesting thing about when we were designing and thinking about the kind of scenario that you're giving for the people that live there guide what the house is. For example, thinking about this not being the very first people to arrive on Mars, it being a small community, and we've got a design for a wider base so that it becomes about living well rather than just surviving. And so I guess the idea of, is it permanent. We're thinking like, people living there for a year or so, Ella, do you think? So that you need to think about living well, but it's still not being all of the answers are solved for you and decided, so it's not permanent.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very different mentality, isn't there, from going to live somewhere where you rent and somewhere where you purchase. I mean, so a lot of people can understand that feeling of being there just for a bit, even if that's 2 or 3 years. It still feels like it's not like a home.
And so that surely connects to the things that Nick and Anna have been talking about in terms of the way you, what objects you might bring to Mars, how you temporarily inhabit a space. Because you recognise that you're not going to be there forever. So how do you make it feel like your home? That reminds me of some of the things I think you talked about before, about workshops you'd had, where people had very different views about how much of Earth you should bring with you and how you'd make a home in a place.
Yeah, there was one interesting discussion we had last time where you mentioned people were trying to make it more like Earth, and then someone came in and said, "Oh, this is you're crazy. What you want to do is make it more like Mars, so that you're living on Mars." Have you had more of those kind of discussions leading up to this? And do you anticipate you're going to have that kind of thing come up again in the workshops?
It already has a bit with our group, because I think people naturally do start to think about, okay, if I don't have very much and I'm away from Earth, what shall I take with me? Maybe I want to have... we had an interesting discussion this week where someone was talking about a painting that they really liked of the rain, that they thought they would want to include in their house because it was so much of Earth. And it reminded me of... those discussions about it can become a bit of just a place for lots of memories of Earth rather than thinking about living. And it is nice to include 1 or 2 things like that, but trying not to get into a spiral of it all being only remembering things.
Yeah, and I guess, that's how we're trying to frame it as well. Like, for the stuff that's being made, it's about how would a future resourceful community work? So that, there's the emphasis on like the day-to-day kind of living in a different way, and that kind of informs everything that you design.
Yeah, I mean, are you able to displace yourselves out of that process so that you're not influencing it in terms of that? People coming to visit, people in the workshops, etc., and even the fact that you've been involved with the design of the building itself and the location that it's in, the city, the vibe of the city, everything. How do you sort of avoid like a sort of groupthink, or you two in particular influencing people to too great an extent? Or is that something you worry about, or are you able to completely remove yourself from the process?
I don't think it should be totally independent of any influence of us. I think, in fact, because of going through such a long process, 7 years, then we're having a lot of the conversations again and again. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. I really think, that is part of the work. You're not done after you've had the conversation once, but also in doing that, then we can bring the research that we've done to create the house into those conversations, and also other people's perspectives from having them in the past. So rather than it being about this isn't a science exhibit, it's also not a scientific study, so it's not about the influence. It's about maybe broadening those conversations and allowing people to go past maybe their first thought and think beyond.
Yeah, I think that's kind of our role, like where we've been like thinking around the subject for such a long time. Yeah, we can add that like a prompt, to kind of deepen the conversation or broaden the conversation, like Nikki said. So it goes beyond, like a lot of conversations on Earth about sustainable living, like they're really like they just operate on one kind of level, or like people might say they think they know what the right answers are, and then you're just saying the same kind of things. This is a chance to look a bit deeper and really kind of turn the situation inside out and examine it from a new angle. So yeah, that's our role really. I think we can frame the discussions within. We've created this the parameters really for the discussion and this context in which to make and think and try out new things.
Yeah, I love the way that this project has potential to create a body of work and outcomes and outputs that effectively sort of have a right to take to be placed in the sort of canon, should we call it, of research around Martian analogues, but to come from an arts-based practice. The idea that body of work that people might turn to in future could now potentially include a project which is consultative, an arts-based practice that is developed and worked on for a reasonable period of time. I think is fantastic. But, so I guess what I'd be interested in there would be outcomes and how you, if you have an image for how you might collate some of this work, how it might get recorded or written or compiled. Are there formal papers to be written to be uploaded to the NASA research server? Are there vox pops, video footage, sketchbooks? How do you imagine collating this body of work?
We're working with, I guess you would call him possibly a researcher, Tim Senior. He's part of an organisation called SuperSum, and they look at working in these multidisciplinary teams. And Tim is going to be coming in and he's going to be interviewing the participants in our group and creating a response to that. Most likely a piece of writing thinking about really how communities work and the outcomes. So that's going to happen. And then also we are going to have our blog, which we're going to be documenting on as well.
I'm interested in the idea that there's particular formats or outputs that suit the nature of the work you're doing. But maybe there's a question there about how you also consider how the existing sector or field expects to receive or engage with information. There might be a body of people out there who are only used to downloading quite dry papers from the NASA server, for example, who actually need to be encouraged to look at other alternatives in their outputs. So that's perhaps a bit of a challenge for your project and for Tim that's doing that work.
Yeah, or if someone was listening and they were like, I can help you with that, then that would be interesting as well.
Is there any other, I mean, aside from this project, is there other examples of a kind of arts-based approach to these kind of questions? I mean, in terms of space exploration, living on Mars, journeys in space, being in a space capsule, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's hundreds of these kind of research programs going on, which are about human experiences. Do you know of any others that are sort of similar in approach to what you've done here in a kind of arts-based practice?
I don't know of any that are presenting themselves as artworks, and I guess there are lots that involve people, and if you want to be a member, you can join, or maybe not lots, there are a few that are like that, are groups of people. Like, I think, of course, there's the Mars Society, which is a members organisation, famously. But and then last time I mentioned the Calgary Space Workers Society. There is a group that is more like a inventors group, and but anyone in that area of Canada can join it, and in that way they work in a way that they're not connected with a big government agency. But I think I'd be interested to hear if there were other artists making similar.
There's been one project recently. I think we might have discussed it on the. Yeah, you had an interview on the show, Matt, didn't you? With the collection of art pieces that were going to be installed. Yeah,
going to ISS. Yeah. All of us seem to have an interest in some arts-based kind of practice. I'm a musician. Rob's an architect. So, and I guess that's what makes this project resonate with people like me and Rob, is the fact that we can, you get to see its kind of validity. Whereas, as an engineer, you might just go, well, these are the questions we need to answer, and here is the experiment that we're going to set up, and we're going to do it using these protocols. And I guess the way that you're approaching is less protocol driven and more of an experience.
And it's also, experience is always a word I try and steer away from, because we don't want people to come to the work and think they're going on a Martian experience. But I guess it's more the art. It is a provocation to think about the future. It's something to get people thinking, and that's the art side of it. And sometimes people say to me and Ella, so what is your artwork like when they're stood inside our artwork? Because it looks like something so different. But it's a conversation starter and a thought-provoking artwork and it is about doing and building and having that. Perhaps you could get caught up in having to solve all of the problems and having all of the answers and never actually getting to the point of building something. And I think in it being an artwork, it allows itself to kind of, like we spoke about before, it can leave gaps and not have all the answers, because that's the invitation for people to come and help fill those and talk about it with us.
I have to say, I think that was perhaps a discussion that might have given Matt and I pause for thought last time when we spoke around that idea. But having been now and visited the building and seen what you've achieved, I think you've absolutely delivered that, and to be commended for that. It's really powerful. I think my main sort of interest really is that you've taken a technical question, what's usually seen as a technical question, how do you survive on Mars, and leveraged social and cultural questions out of it as well. And I think that's a really powerful part of the project too. One of the things I wanted to just reflect on as well, and just to record for some listeners, is I really liked your summary slide on your talk and launch events around the why Mars question, some of which we touched on, but you had a series of bullet points. I'm going to read out because I thought they were really good. Why Mars? A resource scarce environment. There's nothing available at easy disposal. A place where fixing broken items is essential. Living carefully within a circular economy, and a lens for how we live on Earth. And I wanted to read that out because I thought it was a great summary of the project and what we're trying to achieve, and reflects on why I think people out of other sectors should have some interest and pay attention to space science questions and interplanetary questions, because they're questions that are equally applicable to living here on Earth, and taking that same mindset back to living on Earth as well. It's the reason that I even ended up getting involved with this podcast and this discussion, because it helped shape my practice as an architect. So it's a really good summary.
Thanks.
So over the last year since we last talked, what has been, give us your sort of number one challenge, your number one surprise, and your number one favoritist moment?
Oh God. The challenge was just getting it through building regulations. The house, it came down to paperwork and making a building possible, and and getting the donations and things like that. It's very exciting that's a real challenge of building something in a public place.
Yeah, I was going to say, when I looked at such an enormous structure like that, and the way that it sort of is in that particular part of Bristol, it's not like it's hidden away. It's a bit of a thoroughfare, to say the least. And I was thinking, crikey, that must have taken some work to for you to get the permission to do it. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely hats off to you for that, because that obviously looked difficult.
Yeah, so it's not Mars related, because the last year. Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I think when it comes to going to Mars, I think they're going to have to jump through similar hoops of planetary protection, etc., etc. I think that's actually. I imagine that there'll be just as much paperwork to fill in for someone. But were there moments where you actually thought that this just isn't going to be possible? We're being banjaxed all the time.
There was a week when I think it was like, we're so close, but is this really going to be able to be built? And this close to it after so long in the last,
Was that quite recent?
It was probably 6 months ago. So it was quite, so that's been the hardest thing in the last years. Just really simple, practical thing.
Again, that highlights the fact that this is an unusual project because it's a Martian analogue that is in a public space, which has brought technical challenges and building regulations and paperwork issues, but is probably unusual, Matt, to think about a Martian analog experiment which chooses to place itself in a public arena. And that sort of underlines the point of the project, doesn't it?
And then the biggest surprise, I thought it would look good, but I was really surprised how good and how much of a spectacle it is in Bristol. You walk along and you see it, and after so long working on a project, and you meet people and they ask what you do, and now suddenly people are like, oh yeah, I've seen that, because if you're in that area, you can spot it.
I found it almost a little bit daunting when it became so visible. I think we're both it's been such a long journey of getting here, and now it's actually here, and it's whoa, you can't miss it. And it's it's a funny thing for artists put this public artwork in public space. It's very definitely in public space, and here it is for people to respond to. And
what's been your favourite part of the whole project so far?
Well, I mean, there's so many different stages.
But you've got to have a favourite.
The best bit is always just working with people, really. That point when it comes into contact with people and you hear what people think, what it makes them think about. Those conversations are always the most exciting bit. And that's why it's really nice that now it is here and we're in this phase where we're talking to people about it again, and really making things, because there has been a lot of kind of organising and planning and just trying to hold the whole concept together over many years. So it's great. The best bit is when it meets people, when the idea meets people, and then people have more ideas.
Yeah, has there been any kind of disappointing interactions with people? Have you had any sort of people who just don't get it, who are how do you deal with
That's been the nice part, actually. When Ella was saying that, I thought actually also one of the brilliant things has been about how people have got it. I mean, of course, there's some people who aren't gonna, but actually they're probably the people who haven't really read or looked at it in any way. And those people actually so far haven't even walked through the door to come into a workshop yet, because they wouldn't get that far. So so far it's felt quite really nice as an artist to feel that people are understanding the work and your intention.
Which is interesting as well, because that kind of has only been enhanced by the fact that the project has taken so long, that the conversations people are having now on Earth about resources and living more resourcefully are quite different to 7 years ago when we first started it. It's like the context, kind of shifted around it, and that.
What sort of positive sides to it taking that long? Because
Definitely.
You've got workshop attendees who understand isolation.
Yeah,
and
it's very
understand
good, I think, that it did take so long, because I think it wouldn't have been the same project if it hadn't taken so long.
Yeah, it needed the time. It needed the time for us really to develop the ideas. And for it to reach the scale it has, it needed the time. And also the time is something that people respond to when they hear about the project, being like, whoa, you worked for 7 years on this. Then they, it's not just something we only just thought of. They're like, wow. And that kind of helps those conversations. Kind of the dedication and the commitment to do that is, helps those conversations.
Yeah.
Have you got an eye on another city yet? In terms of, have you thought about moving this on and going somewhere else? Like, particularly because one of the interesting things that you talked about last time was this whole idea of setting something like that up in a place where people lived very differently. Somewhere in Africa or somewhere in Japan or somewhere where they lived differently. Have you started thinking about moving it, or have you worked hard enough to get it where it is now?
We do definitely want to tour it. Definitely the top floor, because it's so movable, and what that would look like depends on whoever wants it. It's still open. Like, some people have started talking to us, but nothing really decided about what that could look like. And
would it just be the top floor? Or would you try and move the whole structure?
I mean, the original idea was that we would try and move the whole structure, but now, because of the way it's been built, it doesn't seem so possible. It really is the top floor that is the most tourable. It's the same as the scenario on Mars. It's lightweight, it packs down really small, it's easy to transport. So that is how that could go to different places on Earth.
You could also imagine that top floor being bolted to a slightly different bottom floor on other projects.
Yeah, it could happen.
Yeah, because I kind of wasn't expecting you to be dragging all that sort of plywood and stuff around. I was expecting it to be that you would, find the same sort of collaboration, which as Rob said at the beginning, was unbelievably impressive in terms of the amount of architects, the amount of building firms, the amount of consultants and everything else that you've had involved. I think Rob was basically saying it's virtually everyone in the trade.
It felt like so all the major contractors in the UK on that last slide,
I don't think they'd do it again for us.
Not
donating it. I think there would need to be a lot of money to help to do something of the scale again. And also, actually, me and Ella, we haven't really been paid for a couple of years on it and working other things and stuff. So that part of it would if a venue wanted it in a large scale and had the money to do it, that's the only way that would happen. But luckily, because the top floor is so portable, there is that option to do it in a much smaller way. But equally, that's the most exciting part of the design anyway. So
yeah. But for example, I could be a Japanese artist sitting there in Tokyo going, do you know what? I really want to run this in my smaller town outside Tokyo and phone you up and say, right, I've managed to persuade all these contractors to build me this beautiful bottom bit, but I need your top bit. Is that the sort of thing you're kind of waiting for?
Yeah, it'd be brilliant. But if they also,
that'd be great.
If they also couldn't build the bottom part, we could just put that top part in a box and put it on the plane. It's not.
It's quite flexible. You could imagine it like inside a gallery space or something like that, or inside a museum. I think it would be quite exciting. It doesn't even necessarily have to be outside. It would do something different, and there would be different conversations inside.
I mean, I'd quite like to take it to something like Glastonbury and just have it as my tent.
Yeah.
It would be pretty cool, wouldn't it?
Yeah, proper glamping. think,
it would be.
I'd have one reservation about taking it to somewhere like Tokyo, though, actually, is that you wouldn't get the same sort of shock and pleasurable reaction to the big gold dome, I don't think, because Tokyo particularly has a pretty long history of very unusual, idiosyncratic, surprising pieces of architecture. So I think if you took it there and inflated it, everybody would go, oh, yeah, just another building. Because there's so many unusual structures over there, it would just fit right in. It'll be great to see it move around. And I wonder, just coming back to that question about outputs that we talked about, Nicki, and how you summate some of this work, maybe there's leverage there for some of your outcomes to try and attract other bits of funding and opportunities to reuse it and test it again elsewhere. That'd be really interesting.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
This is what we achieved with version 1. Look at what we could do if we had version 2.
Yeah, I mean, that is the thing as well, I mean, even though it feels like it was such a feat and a journey to get it here, it is a prototype, like maybe it's prototype 1 and it could be remounted in some other way, and then that's the second prototype.
So remind us how long the workshops are going to go on for. How long is it going to be in place?
So we've got family workshops happening just till the end of August, because it's along with summer holidays. And then we'll be working with our group of Bristol based people in our workshops until the end of October. And across that time, there's a chance for people to book viewings that they can go to see the ground floor. You can also book workshops in the hydroponics that Ella spoke about earlier. And then if you want to know more about the design and the design team, including the architects and the scientists that have advised on it, then there's a discussion happening on the 1st of September in the M Shed that people should book right now to come to.
Yes, right. That's next week.
Any particular place online that you want to point people to?
Just
the usual outlets.
Our website, buildingmartianhouse.com, and all of our social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, all Building Martian House. I think Twitter's just Martian House. Also, actually, we're doing this, we're having this VR version of it made, that if people want to go in, then there will be.
Yeah, because then people all around the world can virtually go inside.
When is that available, and where is it?
Pretty soon. It will be on Matterpoint. I don't know what that is, but that's what they are going to host it on. And it's with this company called Future Virtual, is it?
Yeah.
And, so we'll put it on our social media and on our website so people can find it. And there's going to be 2 versions. One that they've done like last week. It was the day of the launch. They came in and they filmed the inside, and then they're going to do another one at the end so people can see the difference that's happened across that time.
Yeah, so it's a 3D scan of the whole structure.
Yeah, 3D scan of the whole building that you can, just click around, or you can put a headset on and actually walk through it.
The Interplanetary podcast is alive!
Yeah, there we go, Rob. Another epically long interview that we've managed to concoct for the listeners there on this subject.
Getting a bit of reputation now for that.
What's your big takeaways for this whole project and our interview?
My big takeaway is that I hope that this goes into the canon of Martian analogues as a body of research and outcomes that brings a different sort of thinking to the table, because it touches on both the technical challenges of making a space and a piece of architecture and a building on Mars, but it leverages the social and cultural stuff. And I think for me, that's a really powerful part of this project. What it also highlighted, or what was really interesting, what I hadn't thought about before, is there's a limit, of course, to what you can achieve with a Martian analog on Earth, because there are technical challenges that you just can't replicate anyway. And it wouldn't be that valuable to try to. So there's aspects that they talked about with the windows and filling it with water, and the grills and fins to try and reduce solar radiation. And there's aspects of that you can achieve and tackle. but you can't really get into the nuts and bolts of exactly what it would be like to use that material in situ. Only so much you can do. But that challenge is then met by the fact that what you can do is open discussion and consultation and dialogue around the actual metaphysical questions of what it is to live in that space. So yeah, powerful stuff.
Like you said, we were talking about certain people from the Mars Society who are accelerationists, et cetera, who would probably not be so thrilled with a project like this because it seems so, it's touching at the kind of fluffy edges of, and I don't mean that insulting. It's touching at the sort of softer edges of a hard problem, and I think so. It's
not Mars Direct.
It's not Mars Direct, and it's none of the sort of crazy projects where you just get people to sort of just go and we'll fund it like people think about the funding of these things more than they think about the actual the purpose and the human element of it is just it seems so absurd, and the point of sending people. It's actually a little bit. I'm going to bring it a little bit back to that kind of AI thing. There seems to be very little purpose of sending humans to Mars unless they can have a human experience there. Yeah. We may as well just send our like mega sophisticated robots with almost sentient intelligence there. They'll be able, in 10 years time, God knows what are like the ability of our robotics and machines will be really. And then that kind of starts to make a bit of a mockery of what it's like why sending humans in the first place, unless it's to have a human experience.
In a sense, that was why I responded the way I did earlier about the Orion capsule. Is why are we sending humans? What's their role? What part of the human experience are we going to be able to research and understand better by putting more people in that 9 cubic meter capacity? They'll have sleeves full of tablets in their sleeping bags, and I'm exaggerating massively.
Yeah,
I'm sure offending lots of people. But I'm just always keen when I come on the show to hold to this question and this debate.
Yeah, I am actually going to just quickly defend engineers and scientists.
Yeah, I think you better.
Because obviously engineers and scientists are human beings that think about these questions all the time. And I in my own profession, I get people coming out from outside in who think they know what I'm up to. In education, they think that you should be doing this. Well, I am doing that, but it is like, and I think that it's quite easy for an artist or an architect or whatever to come in and think that the scientists and engineers aren't thinking about those problems when they're human beings down the pub, very well read, I'm sure, and read science fiction, have heard these criticisms all the time and think about these things all the time.
Yeah.
But then that, an engineer has a job to do, and that job is to come up with solutions that work. And so maybe they're perceived as not necessarily not thinking about the things that you're kind of, that other people are finding more important. But,
absolutely. I'm keen to acknowledge that, I am in much of these conversations sort of exaggerating to make a point, really, just to keep this debate rolling around that quality. And certainly, I mentioned briefly that question of whether or not the Crew Dragon interior engage in this discussion anymore. It certainly looks slicker on the interior and looks like it's been put together with a different sort of level of care. But equally, I suspect there's as much thinking going on there around branding and image.
Well, it's
as there is the actual experience of the astronauts.
Yeah, I mean, there's it looks like the interior of a Tesla for a reason.
Yeah,
and it's
exactly.
So but then branding in itself, I know we kind of, particularly in the music industry, we used to think of it as a dirty word. Branding itself is really important, isn't it, as part of a human experience?
Yeah, because I suppose we build relationships to those brands.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I'm so used to talking to scientists and people like that, it's quite hard for me to interview artists in a way, because you're trying to drag a question out of them that's too direct. It's too direct, and you're never going to get a direct answer off them, because they're kind of thinking slightly differently. It is. They said it themselves, didn't they? That it's the thinking on a different level that when people talk about, you know, environmentalism, that we're always talking about like it on one level, and I think there is an element of truth in that.
Yeah, sort of multiple layers, polyvalent answers, ambiguity being something you have to engage with, which of course is incredibly challenging in rocket science.
During that interview, I asked the question about, did they think about their influencing the output of what they're doing by their own personality and the space that they're in? What did you think about their answer, or even the question?
No, I think it was a very interesting question, actually. I would have liked to have heard about opportunities for very alternative views being brought to the table, where as people who are so embedded, I suppose, in the project, but emotionally, intellectually, it would be interesting to let that space and project be used by somebody coming to it with a complete fresh set of eyes.
Yeah, I suppose you have to remember it is their artwork, isn't it? I don't know enough about like the kind of art that brings in that kind of belongs to everyone that then experiences the art. It's a little bit tricky, isn't it?
It is. So the really sort of challenging philosophical question is that they have goals to create a blank canvas, which they've achieved. How blank is that canvas if it's always being carried by the people who have nurtured it, cared for it, and done such a great job of delivering it? Yeah. But maybe that's tied to the little discussion we had about how the project, it would be great to see it moved and used in other locations. An alternative view, because it was curated and looked after by some other artists or other scientists or engineers, is maybe the way to respond to that. So whilst it sits in Bristol and is being cared for by Ella and Nikki, it's absolutely their project, but it could be packed up, folded up, and given to somebody else. Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me of the Star Wars debate about like George Lucas fiddling around with the films and people going, "Oh, what an idiot!" And it's just like, well, it's his film; he can do what he wants. It's his baby. But it's like, but other people might argue, no, it's not his film anymore. It's part of it's our cultural landscape now. You can't fiddle with it. So it's I think that's quite interesting. Well, I mean, he just ripped off Dune anyway.
Yeah, absolutely ripped off Dune.
So if there's any listeners out there that are huge Star Wars fans that work on the interiors project of the Orion capsule, I am done for. Talk about there.
Yeah. So Rob, what have you got coming up?
What I've got coming up, I am about to go on holiday for a little while, so that's good.
Nice.
So I'll be taking a break. I'm looking forward to that, but not before I finish a bunch of drawings to make a geodesic dome.
Can't you just?
So that connects nicely to habitats, doesn't it?
Yeah, can't you just get Mid-Journey to do your geodesic dome?
Well, I could, but it might be tricky to then get a builder to build it to that drawing and then not sue me.
What have you done, Rob?
That's the limits, you see, of AI, is that who's responsible for that drawing?
Oh, yeah.
If it goes wrong.
Well, that's quite good. You could say, yeah, you'll just have to sue my partner.
Yes.
Unfortunately, my partner doesn't actually exist.
I might use that, actually. So I've got the pleasure of working on a project that's going to be building 2 geodesic domes for a community centre.
Oh, wow.
Which I'm really enjoying. So I'm finishing off those drawings and hopefully getting that built over the autumn.
Wow. Where's that going to be?
In Birmingham.
Nice.
Just near Birmingham city centre, a place called the Edgbaston Reservoir.
I know it well.
So, it's a community centre.
In fact, they call it the reservoir round there. Do you know that? It's really weird. Yeah, the reservoir. It's like it doesn't even sound Brummy, but that's weird.
Well, I hope when it's finished, it will look a little bit like a Martian habitat, perhaps.
Wow, that's
there with its classic glazed dome, geodesic dome look.
Wow.
And people can come along and ask me if I've thought about the human condition.
And you'll say, never thought of it. Sorry, mate.
What?
It's just a piece of engineering. It's just getting the glass in there.
I'll blame Buckminster Fuller. What about you? What have you got coming up?
I've got a holiday. We're both on
holiday.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go on holiday, and then I'm going to hopefully get this podcast out before I go tomorrow, and then come back to a mountain of work. and a new degree, and off I'm running again.
And good luck with that back in term time for us both.
Oh, yes. Can't wait. Can't wait.
All right.
Right. Thanks, Rob.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye, Sparkers.
Bye-bye.